It was said that Kyoto at night was not a city for the faint of heart. Lanterns flickered, shadows stretched across narrow alleys, and the silence was heavy, as though unseen eyes watched from behind every paper screen. One such tale begins on a road leading into the old capital, where a lone samurai returned from his duties long after dusk. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the cicadas cried in the dark. Ahead, a solitary figure stood waiting. At first glance, it seemed like any other traveler, dressed in a plain gray kimono, posture calm, a courteous demeanor. The samurai prepared to exchange the customary greeting, but what followed turned a moment of civility into a memory that would haunt him for life. The figure bowed. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled aside his garment, and there, where a belly or chest should have been, was not flesh, but an eye. A single enormous eye, wet, gleaming, impossibly alive. It blinked. Its gaze pierced through the samurai, stripping him bare not of his armor, but of his dignity. He felt suddenly revealed, as if the eye had glimpsed his hidden fears and desires, all that he never spoke out loud. The samurai staggered back, heart pounding. The figure did not move closer, nor did he speak. He only stared. The unblinking eye followed his every breath. Terror overcame reason, and the warrior fled down the road, chased not by footsteps, but by the memory of being seen in a way no human should be seen. This was Shirime, the butt-eye yokai, a creature more unsettling than violent, more absurd than bloody, yet whose very presence unsettled the mind. Unlike Oni or Yurei, he did not claw, strike, or kill. He revealed himself, and in that revelation, he broke something far deeper, the boundary between dignity and ridicule, intimacy and horror. Origins of the tale. Shirime first appeared in the strange compendiums of Japanese folklore that circulated during the Edo period. While he was never as widespread as creatures like the kappa or tengu, his image lingered precisely because it was so bizarre. The story most often attributed to him comes from Kyoto, a city already rich with ghosts, demons, and tricksters. The tale is brief but potent. A lone samurai meets a stranger on the road, who politely bows, then lifts his robe to reveal an eye where none should be. The samurai, overcome with shock and humiliation, flees. Nothing more, no attack, no death, no aftermath, and yet from this short vignette grew centuries of speculation and fascination. Why did this story endure? Because it captured something essential about fear itself. The most haunting terrors are not those that strike with teeth and claws, but those that unsettle the order of the world, leaving us unsure whether to laugh or tremble. Shirime was that paradox incarnate. The yokai tradition. In the Edo period, yokai were more than monsters. They were reflections of society. They embodied anxieties, taboos, and the absurdities of life under rigid order. While some yokai punished greed or pride, others, like Shirime, operated on a more mysterious level. His presence was not moral in the traditional sense. Instead, it was disruptive. He intruded upon dignity, shattering the composure of proud men like samurai with a spectacle both comical and terrifying. Scholars of folklore often note that yokai like Shirime arose in part from the playfulness of storytelling itself. In nights of drinking, in moments of shared laughter, bizarre tales could flourish. And yet beneath the humor, there was always a shadow. The story of Shirime warned listeners that even the most absurd encounter could leave a scar upon the spirit. The essence of fear and shame. Unlike creatures that fed upon flesh, Shirime fed upon reaction. His power was in the gaze, the sudden, unwanted intimacy of an eye where none should exist. To be seen in such a grotesque way was to be robbed of one's composure. For samurai, whose lives revolved around honor and discipline, such an encounter was devastating. It is telling that Shirime does not harm. He humiliates. He disarms pride with absurdity. His attack is not physical, but psychological, forcing the victim to confront ridicule, vulnerability, and the absurdity of existence itself. In this way, Shirime entered the tapestry of Japanese folklore as a yokai unlike any other. Not a killer, not a lover, not even a thief, but a reminder that terror often comes from being exposed, from having the private self laid bare in the most impossible of ways.
To understand Shirime, one must first step into the world that created him, the Edo period of Japan, 1603 to 1868. It was a time of paradox. On one hand, the Tokugawa shogunate brought peace, stability, and order after centuries of civil war. On the other, it was a time of rigid hierarchy, strict social codes, and an undercurrent of repressed desires that sought release through art, theater, and stories of the strange. Kyoto, where Shirime's tale was said to unfold, was no ordinary city. Though Edo, modern-day Tokyo, had risen as the seat of political power, Kyoto remained the cultural heart of Japan, home to ancient temples, courtly traditions, and the haunting beauty of the floating world. In its narrow streets, dimly lit tea houses, and bustling entertainment districts, stories thrived, whispered among travelers, recorded by scholars, or etched in ink upon woodblock prints. It was here, amid flickering lantern light, that the world of yokai took shape. The yokai craze. The Edo period was sometimes called the Age of Monsters. With peace came leisure, and with leisure came imagination. For the first time, ordinary people, merchants, craftsmen, peasants, had the chance to participate in cultural production. They told stories, collected curiosities, and bought cheap illustrated books known as kusazoshi. Among these were compilations of yokai, supernatural creatures ranging from terrifying demons to ridiculous tricksters. Folklorists like Toriyama Sekien immortalized them in Gazu Hyaki Yagyo, the illustrated night parade of 100 demons, where monsters paraded across the page in vivid detail. Some yokai were ancient, others newly invented. Some warned against moral failings, others were little more than jokes stretched into myth. Shirime belonged firmly in this latter category, yet his staying power suggests there was something more beneath the humor. The role of humor and fear. In Edo, Japan, laughter was never far from fear. Ghost stories were told in summer not only to chill the body, but also to amuse. Plays mixed horror with comedy, making audiences laugh and shudder in the same breath. A yokai like Shirime thrived in this environment. On the surface, he was absurd, a man with an eye in the most unlikely of places. But beneath the absurdity lay a confrontation with deeply rooted fears, the fear of shame, of ridicule, of being seen in a way that stripped away honor. For the samurai class, whose identity rested upon composure and discipline, to encounter Shirime was to be undone by the ridiculous. He was an inversion of their world, the mighty undone not by sword or demon, but by the grotesque comedy of a gaze. Kyoto's stage of shadows. The city of Kyoto itself played an important role in the shaping of this legend. Known for its beauty and refinement, it was also a place of transience and secrets. At night, its streets became liminal spaces where reality blurred with imagination. Lanterns cast long shadows. Travelers hurried past shrines whispering prayers to unseen gods, and storytellers filled the darkness with voices of the uncanny. Shirime, then, was not only a figure of legend, but also a mirror of Kyoto's atmosphere. Elegant, unsettling, absurd, and frightening all at once. Symbolism in Edo society. Edo Japan was obsessed with order, class divisions, etiquette, ritual. Yet within this order lived anxiety, fear of disgrace, fear of exposure, fear of the hidden being revealed. Yokai stories served as outlets for these fears. Shirime symbolized an invasion of dignity. He appeared suddenly, politely even, but revealed something that stripped away the illusion of control. He was not violent, but he was destabilizing. His very existence mocked social pretenses, reminding listeners that beneath the veneer of civility lay vulnerability. In this sense, Shirime was not only a ghost story, but a cultural critique. He poked fun at the rigidity of the samurai, exposed the fragility of honor, and reminded commoners that even the mighty could be undone by laughter. Thus, in the fertile soil of Edo society, its rigid codes, its flourishing arts, and its fascination with the grotesque, Shirime took root. He was not simply a monster of the road, but a creature born from the anxieties and amusements of his time.
If one were to catalog the creatures of Japanese folklore, few would appear as strange, as unsettling, and yet as oddly comical as Shirime. Unlike the grotesque oni with their horns and clubs, or the elegant yurei with their pale gowns and flowing black hair, Shirime did not rely on a majestic or terrifying silhouette. Instead, his body was ordinary, unremarkable even, until the moment of revelation. At first sight, Shirime was just another traveler of the Edo roads. He wore plain garments, often described as a simple kimono
or robe, the kind any commoner might don. His demeanor was polite, almost disarming. He bowed respectfully, spoke little, and behaved like an ordinary man. It was this mundanity that made the horror more profound. There was nothing unusual, nothing threatening, until the instant he lifted his robes. And there it was, where human anatomy would expect flesh, muscle, or bone. A single enormous eye stared back. Gleaming, wet, and alive, it blinked with impossible calm. Accounts say it shone faintly in the darkness, a lantern of flesh, illuminating the world in a way no mortal eye could. The power of the gaze. The eye has always held special meaning in Japanese culture, as in many others. It is the organ of perception, of truth, of hidden power. To be seen is to be known. To be gazed upon is to be judged. In the folklore of Japan, eyes often reveal more than mouths. They betray ghosts, expose fox spirits, and give away concealed intentions. Shirime's single, misplaced eye embodied all these fears. It was not just the shock of anatomy undone. It was the feeling of being pierced by sight in a place that was meant to remain unseen. His gaze was intrusive, intimate in the most grotesque sense. For the samurai, whose honor demanded composure, this gaze was unbearable. It was as though the eye looked not at the body, but through the soul, tearing away the veneer of dignity to expose what lay beneath: weakness, shame, fear. The duality of absurdity and terror. One of the reasons Shirime endures is because of this dual quality. On one hand, his appearance borders on ridiculous, even laughable. To hear the story in a tavern might elicit chuckles from listeners. And yet, when placed in the context of a lonely road at night, the humor gives way to dread. This duality is central to yokai lore. Many creatures lived at the edge of comedy and horror. Their very absurdity amplified the fear they inspired. For Shirime, the eye symbolized both ridicule and revelation. It made men laugh nervously, then shudder at the thought of encountering it themselves. The all-seeing eye. Some scholars of folklore interpret Shirime as a parody of the all-seeing gaze of authority. In Edo Japan, surveillance was constant. Samurai monitored commoners, officials monitored districts, and the shogunate kept watch over all. Shirime's eye, absurdly located, may have reflected a deeper anxiety, that no matter where one was, no matter what dignity one tried to maintain, someone or something could be watching. But unlike the state's watchful eye, Shirime's gaze was not for control. It was for humiliation. He did not strike with sword or claw. He struck with vision. His victims walked away uninjured, but forever unsettled, their pride pierced by laughter and fear. The body as the stage of fear. Shirime's horror also lies in how he used the body itself as the stage. Whereas many yokai transformed into animals, wielded supernatural powers, or appeared in terrifying forms, Shirime inverted expectations, by turning what was private into something horrifyingly visible. In this sense, he belongs to a long lineage of yokai that blurred the line between body and monstrosity. Roku for instance, stretched her neck impossibly long. No Perabo erased the face entirely. Shirime inverted expectations by turning what was private into something horrifyingly visible. Thus, Shirime's appearance was simple yet unforgettable. A man in plain clothes, polite and courteous, until he revealed the impossible. An eye, misplaced yet all-seeing, that transformed humor into horror, and laughter into lasting unease.
If Shirime was a yokai of revelation, then the people he chose to reveal himself to were never random. Folklore rarely wastes its characters. The victims of his appearances, whether frightened samurai, weary travelers, or wandering monks, were chosen with a symbolic precision that reflected the cultural anxieties of Edo Japan. Each encounter told not only a tale of shock and laughter, but also a deeper commentary on society itself. The lonely traveler. Most often, Shirime appeared on desolate roads, far from the warmth of lanterns or the comfort of inns. The lonely traveler was the quintessential target, someone adrift between destinations, vulnerable to the liminal space of night. Travel in Edo Japan was common yet dangerous. Pilgrims walked great distances to temples, merchants carried goods between towns, and peasants sometimes journeyed to market. On the road, one was neither entirely safe nor entirely at risk, an ideal stage for the supernatural to intrude. For these travelers, the sudden appearance of a polite stranger was not unusual. Etiquette demanded greetings, bows, and respect. But what followed, the grotesque revelation of Shirime's eye, was the ultimate violation of that fragile trust. It transformed the road from a place of passage into a place of terror. Travelers symbolized the ordinary person, unprepared for cosmic absurdity. By targeting them, Shirime turned every journey into a potential brush with the uncanny, reminding listeners that danger was not always in the form of bandits or storms, but in encounters with the inexplicable. The proud samurai. Perhaps the most iconic of Shirime's victims were samurai. The warrior class stood as symbols of honor, discipline, and composure. They were trained to face death without flinching, to remain unshaken by fear. Yet in Shirime's tale, it is precisely the samurai who flees in terror. This inversion was no accident. Yokai tales often mocked or humbled the powerful. To show a samurai undone not by steel or sorcery, but by the absurdity of an eye where no eye should be, was to remind listeners that even the proudest could be made ridiculous. The samurai's fear also reflected the fragility of their code. Bushido demanded control of the body and mind, but Shirime unraveled that control with a single grotesque gesture. He did not strike them down, he made them run. Their swords, their training, their oaths meant nothing against the paralyzing intimacy of his gaze. For commoners who heard the story, it was both terrifying and liberating. Even those at the top of society's ladder were vulnerable to humiliation. The wandering monk. Another figure occasionally tied to Shirime's encounters was the monk. Monks, especially itinerant ones, were symbols of spiritual strength and detachment. They walked the roads in search of alms or enlightenment, embodying life free from worldly shame. Yet they too were susceptible to the yokai's intrusion. When Shirime appeared before monks, the meaning was layered. Was the monk truly detached, or could even he be unsettled by absurdity? Did the grotesque eye mock his vows or serve as a test of spiritual endurance? Folklore rarely gives answers, but the questions linger. For listeners, these tales reinforced that Shirime was not selective by wealth, power, or piety. He targeted anyone, anywhere. His appearance was a reminder that no one, not even the spiritually enlightened, could entirely escape embarrassment or fear. Why these figures? Together, the traveler, the samurai, and the monk formed a trinity of Edo society: the ordinary, the powerful, and the spiritual. By choosing these types, Shirime's stories encompassed the full spectrum of humanity. His terror was universal. But his purpose was not destruction. He never killed, never wounded, never even touched. His method was exposure. To the traveler, he shattered trust. To the samurai, he stripped pride. To the monk, he tested detachment. In each case, the effect was the same: fear, humiliation, and the memory of having been seen in a way no one wished to be seen. Thus, Shirime was not a monster of the elite or the lowly. He was a monster of everyone. His reach was as wide as the imagination of those who whispered his story.
When we imagine monsters, we think of claws, fangs, and violence. But Shirime's craft was subtler, more insidious. He did not need to harm the body. He struck the mind. His methods of fear lay in disruption, in humiliation, in the sudden inversion of what was proper and expected. That is why his legend endured, not as a tale of gore, but as a story of psychological horror. The polite approach. Perhaps the most unnerving aspect of Shirime was his civility. He did not leap from shadows or roar like an oni. He approached with the courtesy of a fellow traveler. His bow was respectful, his posture unthreatening. In Edo Japan, where etiquette governed every interaction, this politeness was disarming. It lulled the victim into security. A lone traveler might think, just another man on the road. A samurai might lower his guard, prepared for a formal greeting. A monk might see nothing but a humble stranger. And then, without warning, the mask of normalcy shattered. This inversion was his first weapon, the betrayal of expectation. The sudden revelation. The moment Shirime revealed himself was the fulcrum of terror. With one deliberate gesture, lifting his robe, exposing the impossible eye, he transformed the familiar into the grotesque. The eye did not need to attack. It stared, it blinked, it saw. And in that silent gaze, the victim felt a collapse of reality. Anatomy had been rewritten. The private had become public. The absurd had become horrifying. This was not terror of physical harm, but of exposure. The victim felt seen in a way that was unbearable, stripped of composure and control. Fear mingled with shame, leaving scars deeper than wounds. The intimacy of the gaze. The gaze itself was his greatest weapon. Unlike a sword or claw, it was intimate. It suggested closeness, knowledge, intrusion. Victims often described the sensation of being known, of having their hidden fears, secrets, and vulnerabilities laid bare under that unblinking stare. This intimacy was unsettling, precisely because it crossed boundaries. To be gazed upon in such a grotesque way was to feel mocked, judged, even desecrated. Samurai fled not because of danger, but because their honor could not withstand that humiliation. Travelers ran because they could not bear to be stripped of dignity. Monks faltered because detachment crumbled under the absurdity of what they saw. Fear without violence. Unlike most yokai, Shirime never struck, never chased,
not even touched his victims. He did not need to. The terror was self-inflicted, blossoming in the victim's mind. The encounter ended the moment the victim fled. Yet this was his triumph, the fact that he lingered in memory. Days, months, even years later, those who had seen him would remember the glistening eye, the feeling of being stripped bare. His cruelty was psychological permanence. The element of absurdity. Part of Shirime's genius was the way he balanced fear with absurdity. To describe the story in daylight might make listeners laugh, but to live it in the dark, alone, was to feel dread coil around the spine. Absurdity disarmed. It confused the mind, leaving victims unsure whether to laugh, cry, or scream. And in that confusion, fear took root. It is this paradox of comedy turned horror that made Shirime's legend unforgettable. The ritual of encounter. Folklore suggests that Shirime's appearances followed a ritualistic pattern. First, the polite bow. Second, the raising of the garment. Third, the gaze. Always the same, always deliberate. The repetition made his acts into a kind of theater, a performance meant not only for the victim, but for the audience who would later hear the tale. Listeners knew what was coming, and yet they leaned forward in anticipation, just as victims knew something was wrong, yet could not look away. The ritual itself was the source of both fear and fascination. The lasting impact. Shirime's victims walked away unscathed in body, but forever altered in spirit. They had not faced death, but they had faced humiliation. They had not lost blood, but they had lost dignity. That loss, in a society built on honor and composure, was in some ways worse than physical harm. In this way, Shirime was a master of psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. His terror was not measured in corpses, but in memories. He haunted the mind, not the flesh. Thus, Shirime's methods were simple yet devastating. Courtesy, revelation, gaze. No violence, no pursuit, no words. Only the unbearable exposure of being seen in an impossible way. And for many, that was enough to shatter the self.
When the stories of Shirime are retold, what stands out is not blood, nor death, nor wounds. What lingers is the memory. Those who saw him walked away alive, yet they carried something heavier than an injury. The burden of having been exposed to the absurd, the grotesque, the inexplicable. For many, this was a wound that never healed. The imprint of the eye. Folklorists often describe Shirime's gaze as a form of imprinting. It was as if the eye burned itself into the victim's mind. Survivors spoke of seeing it even in dreams, blinking behind their eyelids, staring from the darkened corners of rooms. Some would jolt awake at night, convinced they were being watched. Others avoided lonely roads altogether, fearing the sudden reappearance of that impossible stranger. The terror was not physical, but psychological. A glance became a curse, not because Shirime followed, but because the victim could never unsee what they had seen. The collapse of certainty. To meet Shirime was to lose one's trust in the natural order. Anatomy had been rewritten. Etiquette had been weaponized. The absurd had invaded reality. For many, this was the wound that never healed. Travelers who once trusted the roads now feared every shadow. Samurai who once prided themselves on composure now doubted their own courage. Monks who once claimed detachment now wrestled with the absurd. The encounter with Shirime collapsed their certainty in the world, leaving only doubt. The weight of shame. One of the deepest wounds Shirime inflicted was shame. In Edo Japan, shame could be as destructive as violence. To run in fear, to lose composure, to be made ridiculous,
These were failures that haunted the spirit. Samurai in particular bore this weight heavily. Trained to face death with honor, they could not reconcile their terror of a grotesque eye. Many tales emphasize the irony that a warrior who would stand against swords and arrows could not withstand the absurd humiliation of Shirime's gaze. For commoners, the shame was more private, but no less painful. They felt mocked by the universe itself, reduced to helpless laughter or screams by something that should not exist. Nightmares and retellings. In folklore, memory is contagious. Those who saw Shirime could not help but tell others. Around the hearth, in taverns, along the roads, they would recount the tale, not to boast, but to unburden. Yet in the telling, the memory grew stronger. Listeners laughed, shuddered, and spread the tale further. In this way, Shirime became not only a personal terror, but a communal one. The memory of a single victim became the fear of an entire village. The yokai did not need to appear often. His legend multiplied through the human mind. The loneliness of knowing. There was also a deeper loneliness in the victim's experience. To see Shirime was to glimpse the absurd fabric of reality itself. How could one explain such a vision without sounding mad? Even as the story spread, those who had truly encountered him bore the isolation of knowing it was real. That isolation fed the horror. To live with the memory was to live apart, carrying a secret that separated them from others. The eye stared not only at the victim, but at their place in the world. The transformation of fear into folklore. Over time, these psychological scars shaped the legend itself. The more the stories were told, the more they reflected the haunting persistence of memory. Shirime was not a demon of death, but of recollection. He thrived not in the moment of encounter, but in the endless replaying of that encounter in the mind. This was his genius. He struck once, and the victim carried him forever. Thus, Shirime was not simply a prankster of the supernatural, he was a master of memory, a yokai who proved that the most lasting horrors are not carved in flesh, but etched in the mind. His victims lived, but they lived changed, haunted by the impossible, shamed by their reaction, and forever stalked by the gaze of an eye that should not exist. At first glance, Shirime might seem like a joke carried too far, a prankster spirit meant only to amuse. But in the moral and cultural landscape of Edo Japan, nothing was ever just a joke. Behind the laughter lurked unease, and behind unease lay truths about society. Shirime's legend endured not because it was funny, but because it touched nerves that ran deep. The fear of shame, the terror of being exposed, the humiliation of ridicule. Shame as a weapon. In Edo society, shame was as powerful as steel. A warrior's honor could be undone not only by defeat in battle, but by the loss of composure. A monk's reputation could collapse if he succumbed to worldly absurdity. A traveler's dignity could evaporate if he returned trembling, unable to speak of what he saw. Shirime weaponized shame. He did not strike at the body, he struck at the image of the self. He dismantled pride, mocked discipline, and pierced through masks of composure. By doing so, he became a reflection of society's deepest anxieties, that no one, however noble or pious, was safe from humiliation. The fear of exposure. The grotesque eye was more than a body joke. It was a metaphor for exposure. To be seen by Shirime was to be laid bare in a way that violated every boundary. His gaze was impossible, intrusive, obscene. But it was also symbolic. It revealed what people most feared, that their secrets, weaknesses, or hidden desires could be uncovered at any moment. In a culture built upon strict etiquette,
where emotions were masked and desires suppressed, the idea of being revealed was terrifying. Shirime embodied this terror, transforming it into a story that people could laugh at nervously but never truly dismiss. The humor that cuts. Japanese folklore often blurred the line between comedy and horror. Laughter was not an escape from fear, but its companion. To laugh at Shirime was to admit that the story was absurd. To fear him was to realize that absurdity could still wound. In this way, Shirime operated like a mirror held up to his audience. The joke was on the samurai who ran. The joke was on the monk who faltered. The joke was on anyone who thought themselves above humiliation. And in that joke was a warning. None are immune. The critique of authority. In some scholars, Shirime see Shirime as satire, a parody of power. In Edo Japan, surveillance was constant. The shogunate maintained strict watch over its people. Lords watched their retainers. Communities policed themselves. Shirime's misplaced eye might have been an exaggerated image of that anxiety, the sense that one was always watched, even in places meant to be private. But unlike the watchful eye of government, Shirime's gaze offered no order, no justice, only humiliation. His eye was anarchic, stripping away dignity not for control, but for mockery. In this way, he was both a figure of fear and rebellion, mocking the very structures that claim to control human behavior. The universality of vulnerability. The ultimate symbolism of Shirime is universality. He did not choose only the weak or the corrupt. He targeted samurai, travelers, monks, symbols of strength, ordinary life, and spirituality. His message was clear. No one is beyond embarrassment. No one is shielded from being made ridiculous. This universality made him enduring. People could laugh at the misfortune of others, but secretly they knew they too could be undone by a gaze that exposed what they wished to keep hidden. A lesson in humility. Thus, Shirime's moral lesson was one of humility. Do not believe yourself beyond ridicule. Do not assume dignity is unshakable. Even the strongest warrior, the most devout monk, the most ordinary traveler can be brought low by a moment of absurdity. For Edo audiences, this was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Terrifying because it meant vulnerability was universal. Comforting because it meant that shame was shared, that no one laughed alone and no one feared alone. In this way, Shirime's legend became more than a prank. It was a mirror, a lesson, and a warning. Behind the grotesque eye lay the truth that fear and shame walk hand in hand, and that dignity is always one revelation away from collapse.
Shirime was not alone in his strangeness. Japanese folklore teems with beings who distort the human body, twisting it into shapes that blur the line between the familiar and the grotesque. These yokai reveal how deeply the human form is tied to fear, shame, and fascination. By comparing Shirime with his kindred spirits, Rokurokubi, Noperabo, and others, we can better understand why his legend survived and why the manipulation of the body is one of the most enduring motifs in horror. Rokurokubi, the stretching neck. Among the most famous of body-distorting yokai is Rokurokubi. By day, she appeared as an ordinary woman. By night, her neck stretched impossibly long, twisting through the darkness like a serpent. Sometimes she frightened travelers. Sometimes she tormented her husband. Sometimes she merely drifted, her head moving through spaces it did not belong. Like Shirime, Rokurokubi was absurd at first glance. A neck stretching into the night might elicit laughter, but as with Shirime's misplaced eye, the humor quickly curdled into horror. To see the body betray its natural limits was to feel the collapse of certainty. Both yokai embodied the fear that what we trust most, our own form, can turn against us. Noperabo, the faceless ghost. If Rokurokubi terrified through excess, Noperabo terrified through absence. This yokai appeared as an ordinary person until it turned to reveal a face without features. Smooth skin, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, nothing. Noperabo shared Shirime's method of fear, surprise and revelation. Both creatures lulled the victim into comfort with ordinary appearance, then shattered it by exposing the impossible. For Shirime, it was the grotesque presence of an eye. For Noperabo, the grotesque absence of one. Together, they revealed two sides of the same terror, that identity itself can be erased or rewritten. The grotesque and the ridiculous. Japanese folklore often reveled in the ridiculous as much as the terrifying. Yokai like tanuki, shape-shifting raccoon dogs, were notorious for transforming their bodies in absurd ways, often enlarging or disguising parts of themselves for comic effect. These stories were humorous, yet they carried the same underlying theme, the instability of the body. Shirime belonged to this lineage. His grotesque eye was both laughable and horrifying, absurd and terrifying. In this way, he straddled the same line that tanuki tales did, eliciting laughter in daylight, but inspiring unease when remembered at night. The body as theater. What all these yokai share is a focus on the body as theater. Rokurokubi stretches it, Noperabo erases it, Tanuki reshapes it, Shirime subverts it. The body becomes not a vessel of identity, but a stage upon which horror plays out. This fascination reflected Edo society's complex relationship with physicality. On one hand, propriety demanded restraint, etiquette, and control. On the other, folklore delighted in breaking those rules, imagining bodies twisted, exposed, or mocked. Yokai stories gave people permission to laugh at what they frightened them, and to fear what made them laugh. Shirime's unique place. Among these yokai, Shirime holds a unique position. Rokurokubi's long neck can still be explained as monstrous strength. Noperabo's facelessness can be seen as ghostly transformation. Tanuki's tricks are rooted in shape-shifting tradition. But Shirime's eye? It defies reason entirely. It is not an exaggeration of the body, nor the erasure of it, nor the trick of it. It is absurdity itself, made flesh. That absurdity is his strength. It ensures he is never forgotten because he unsettles in a way no other yokai quite manages. He mocks not only the body, but the very idea of what should and should not exist. Thus, in the company of other yokai, Shirime is both kin and outsider. Like them, he manipulates the body to provoke laughter and fear. Unlike them, he does so with a surreal simplicity that makes him at once ridiculous and unforgettable.
Unlike many yokai whose images proliferated across scrolls, prints, and plays, Shirime remained something of a shadow figure in Japanese art. His appearances were rare, fleeting, almost as if artists and storytellers themselves struggled with how to depict him. And yet, when he did emerge on the page or stage, he left an impression as bizarre and haunting as the tale itself. In folklore collections, the earliest mentions of Shirime come not from popular theater or visual art, but from oral tradition and written anecdotes. He is recorded most famously in Konjaku Gazu Zoku Hyakki by Toriyama Sekien, the great Edo period cataloger of yokai. Sekien's work compiled countless strange beings, from terrifying demons to playful tricksters. Shirime's inclusion in such a collection cemented his place in the yokai pantheon. Though his tale was brief, little more than the story of a samurai startled on a dark road, it was enough to ensure that he would live on among the 100 demons of folklore. The absence of images. One of the most striking aspects of Shirime's legacy is the scarcity of visual depictions. While creatures like Kappa and Tengu were endlessly drawn, Shirime remained elusive. Perhaps it was embarrassment. Perhaps it was that artists and storytellers themselves struggled with how to depict him. And yet, when he did emerge on the page or stage, he left an impression as bizarre and haunting as the tale itself. In theater and storytelling, though Shirime was never a central figure in kabuki or no, his stories circulated in the rakugo tradition, comic storytelling performances that thrived on the absurd. In these tales, Shirime often served as a punchline, the strange stranger on the road who revealed an eye where none should be. Audiences laughed, but beneath the humor lingered a shiver. In this way, Shirime lived not as a painted figure, but as a voice in the dark, a story told for both laughter and unease. In the modern times, Shirime has found a curious place in popular culture. While still rare, he has appeared in manga, anime, and internet discussions of yokai. His absurdity makes him both comedic and unsettling, perfect for the modern blend of horror and humor. Artists today sometimes embrace his strangeness directly, sketching him with exaggerated features or surreal beauty. In these interpretations, he becomes not just a prankster, but a symbol of how folklore can blur boundaries between the terrifying and the ridiculous, the shameful and the profound. The power of suggestion. What keeps Shirime alive in culture is not constant representation, but the power of suggestion. A single mention, a single story is enough to conjure his image in the mind's eye. Unlike yokai, who require elaborate mythology, Shirime survives because he is simple, a man, a bow, a revelation. His story endures because it does not need elaboration. It lives in the imagination, changing with every retelling, haunting not through repetition, but through possibility. Thus, Shirime's artistic and literary legacy is paradoxical, sparse yet powerful, fleeting yet unforgettable. He may not stride across countless scrolls or dominate plays, but he lives in whispers, in nervous laughter, and in the unease that follows whenever one walks a lonely road at night.
Shirime is, at his heart, a paradox. He is at once ridiculous and terrifying, laughable and unforgettable. His story contains no bloodshed, no violence, no tragic ending. Yet it lingers in the mind more stubbornly than tales of demons with horns or ghosts in white. The power of Shirime lies not in what he does, but in what he represents. The unsettling collapse of dignity, the terror of being exposed, the universality of humiliation. Fear beyond violence. In a world where yokai often killed, devoured, or cursed, Shirime stood apart. He did not harm the flesh, he unsettled the spirit. His encounters ended not with death, but with laughter twisted into fear, and fear twisted into shame. He proved that horror does not always need claws or fangs, that the most lasting terrors can come from absurdity itself. A mirror of society. For Edo Japan, Shirime was more than a prankster. He was a mirror. His grotesque gaze reflected anxieties about surveillance, honor, and the fragility of human pride. To meet Shirime was to realize that even the strongest samurai, the wisest monk, or the humblest traveler could be undone by ridicule. This universality made him unforgettable. His story cut across classes and beliefs, reminding everyone that dignity was fragile, that exposure was terrifying, and that shame was the great equalizer. The power of the absurd. Shirime endures because he embodies the strange marriage of comedy and horror. He is proof that laughter and fear are not opposites, but companions. To laugh at his absurdity is to admit that the grotesque unsettles us. To fear him is to recognize that humiliation wounds deeper than wounds of the body. In this way, Shirime anticipates modern horror itself, which so often blends the ridiculous with the terrifying, unsettling audiences not through violence, but through the collapse of the ordinary into the surreal. Shirime today. Though rare in art and literature, Shirime's legend continues to be retold in books on yokai, in manga, in late-night conversations about the strange. His simplicity ensures his survival. He requires no elaborate mythology, no complex genealogy. He is only a man, a bow, a revelation. That simplicity makes him endlessly adaptable, a ghost for any age. In the digital age, where surveillance is constant and privacy fragile, Shirime's eye feels newly relevant. The fear of being watched, of being revealed, of losing control of one's dignity. These anxieties are no less potent today than they were on Edo roads centuries ago. The eternal gaze. And so Shirime lives on, not as a figure of mass depictions or great tragedies, but as an enduring whisper of unease. His eye blinks in the dark corners of imagination, reminding us that the human form is fragile, dignity fleeting, and laughter never far from fear. To meet Shirime is not to die, but to live with the knowledge that horror can be absurd, that shame can be eternal, and that even the proudest among us can be undone by a single glance.